Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion today on the federal government's new emissions cap for the oil and gas sector in this country. The new framework says emissions in the sector will need to be reduced 35 to 38% below 2019 levels by 2030. It's a critical part of the Liberal climate policy plan, but it's drawn a lot of pushback from Western Canada. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, for example, says she's ready for another court fight with Ottawa over it and is calling the measures punitive for her province.
There's no question that if they continue on this path, it will end up with court. And I think in court, and I think we will win. We have now seen the federal government lose 2 cases at the federal court level because they continue to use their jurisdiction as a pretext to invade ours.
Saskatchewan is also against the cap, saying it targets and burdens the province's energy industry. Saskatchewan's Premier Scott Moe joins us from that same UN climate conference, COP28, in Dubai. Hi, Premier. Pleasure to welcome you back to the show. Thanks for making the time.
Thanks so much, Vassy.
Premier, the oil and gas sector make up a third of the emissions in this country. If we're trying collectively to reduce emissions in the country, doesn't a cap make sense?
No. The oil and gas sector is reducing emissions and is committed to reducing additional emissions, and they don't need a layering on. And that's exactly what we're seeing happening here just this week, layering on a number of additional regulations on regulations that have already been imposed on the oil and gas sector. What we're doing here in Dubai at COP28 is bringing not only all of our industries, but our oil and gas industry to discuss about how, what they are doing to reduce emissions in our production systems in Saskatchewan. And the fact is, if the rest of the world utilized the systems that are already in place in Saskatchewan, global emissions from oil production would drop 25%. There's a record that we can be proud of as Saskatchewan residents and Canadians.
I think what you're referencing is the sort of technological advances through carbon capture that many of the big oil companies in this country have committed to pursuing. I wonder, though, if it again makes sense for there to be further incentives and some consequences if they don't pursue it, given their track record so far. I know they've started to talk about it and committed to goals, but they made collectively, the big 6 oil companies, $35 billion in profits in 2022. They invested $500 million of that in pursuing the technology that you're referencing.
And my understanding is that they will invest in that technology if they can have some certainty of regulation out into the future. We have one company that's used the carbon off a CCS facility in an enhanced oil recovery situation. They've sequestered 41 million tons of carbon. They're net zero and have been operating at net zero capacity for some period of time, and I'm not familiar of anywhere else in the world. I've been asking around at COP28 of any other net zero oil company operating. But in addition to that, in Saskatchewan, we have companies that are here that have reduced their methane emissions 59% over the last 3 years alone. And so committed to going to an 80% reduction by 2030, committed to being fully net zero by 2050, which does match up with the federal targets of being net zero by 2050. And so what the energy industry needs, I think, is the broader long-term target that's consulted on between the federal, provincial governments as well as the industry, rather than a layering on of policy after regulation after policy after regulation, which was what we are seeing.
But this is, with respect, Premier, not exactly as you lay it out. I mean, that what they had originally proposed, to be fair, it sounded like was going to amount to a production cut. They did consult with industry. Industry says, okay, we can't get to 42%, but we can, through technology, get to 20% below 2019 levels. And after that, you're going to have to come up with something else. And so they did. Like, to me, what this looks like is over the last year, they did listen to industry. They acknowledged through the new regulations that we can't impose what we thought we could impose on because it would amount to a production cut. So we're going to do this instead. How does that not offer regulatory certainty to that industry going forward?
And this will, but this is yet another regulation that is layered on the methane regulations that came earlier this week, layered on a carbon taxation policy that came a few years ago, layered on the clean electricity regulations that are going to impact our oil production, the cost of our oil production, layered on the clean fuel standard, all of which are going to increase the regulatory uncertainty for oil production across Canada, put essentially our energy security at risk in this nation, which I think is something that we should really be giving some second thought to as we look as to what has happened in some countries around the world that have chosen to do just that.
But how do the specificity of regulations, how does the specificity of regulations that you just laid out contribute to uncertainty? Doesn't it do just the opposite?
No, it doesn't. The specificity of regulations will be, for example, choosing base years for companies to operate under, choosing, the specificity of the regulations is actually where the challenge is. As I said, we have one net zero company, oil producing company operating in Saskatchewan already. What they need is the certainty of regulations, yes, but then they also need the flexibility so that they are able to make the investments, whether that be in additional CCS or additional methane reductions, as opposed to following a step-by-step roadmap that someone in Ottawa might be putting forward that really doesn't have a very good understanding of the industry to begin with.
Again, though, what proof do you have, or what evidence can you share with Canadians tonight that those companies that you refer to are going to follow through on, expanding carbon capture, for example, to the scale, which we don't yet have proven can work on the scope and the scale that they're saying that it will, and again, that they haven't yet invested the dollars that they're going to have to in order to fulfill those promises. In fact, they didn't even come close last year. Won't these kinds of regulations force them to do that?
No, the challenge around making the billions of dollars of investment, and in Saskatchewan's case, it is billions of dollars as well, is that the goalposts continue to move. The methane emissions that were released earlier this week are different and a change from where they were and where the province had agreed to with the federal government previously. And so as the goalposts continue to move, it makes for a very challenging environment. None of this is good for Canadians. Our energy costs will increase. We will start purchasing our energy from much less countries with much less environmental regulations than we even have today. And most certain. So what we need essentially is just a little bit of regulatory certainty so that the companies can make the investments that they have committed to. And as I said, in Saskatchewan's case, the one company is committed to being net zero by 2050. That matches Canada's target. If they're committed to doing that, that means if they have the ability to have that regulatory certainty, they're going to make those investments.
But how do you know that they will? What proof have they shown you so far that they're committed to? Again, $500,000 out of $35 billion of profit doesn't send a strong signal, does it?
Well, I guess the proof is that same company has reduced their methane emissions by 59% in the last 3 years. So they are not just talking, they are walking the walk, and they've committed to doing an 80% reduction by the year 2030 and additional investments in CCS to make them net zero by 2050. This is exactly what we want our energy industry to do so that we can be nationally secure when it comes to providing energy for Canadians. And we are going to need oil and gas for some period of time into the future. And I would suggest we don't want to be buying it from places like Russia.
Doesn't, though, and final question before I let you go, I know your time is limited, Premier, but doesn't this suite of measures that essentially make us, as the government would characterize it, leaders in the space, better position us going forward to be able to sell our product when it does meet all these standards? And I take your point about some jurisdictions like Russia, for example, in the Middle East not adhering to the same ones. But if we look to our closest neighbor, the United States, we are moving in the example of methane reductions in lockstep with them.
We have a much more sustainable energy production system than many areas around the world. As I said, if the Saskatchewan current regulations were adopted around the world, emissions from energy production would drop 25%. What the industry needs is some certainty, not a layering of policy after policy after policy. The energy industry is willing and has shown they're willing in Saskatchewan's case to make the investments that are necessary to reduce emissions, as I said, and ultimately, in the worst case scenario, that we're buying that gas from somewhere like Russia.
Okay, Premier, I'll leave it there. Appreciate your time today very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Vassy.